The wreck announced itself before dawn. Not the sound of it. The water swallowed that, as it swallowed everything in a storm of that size. But the change in the light's reflection off the outer rocks, the quality of the spray pattern shifting from what it had been all night into something that meant an obstruction had appeared that had not been there before. Lyra was already at the housing when it changed, already scanning the water, her hand on the glass to feel the vibration the mechanism made when it tracked cleanly and the different vibration it made when something was wrong. Something was wrong. She went down the path in the gray before first light with a rope and a lantern and the particular deliberateness of a woman who understood that moving fast on a wet cliff in the dark was how one body became two wrecks instead of one. The sea was still throwing itself against the rocks below, the storm not finished even as the worst of it was past. She could hear the water, and she could smell the wreckage before she reached the base. Wet timber, the particular bitterness of a cargo hold open to the sea. Two men. One had his face in a tidal pool when she found him, and she turned him over and worked until she understood that nothing more was going to happen here. And she laid him straight on the rock and weighted his coat with a stone so the water would not take him. And she moved on. The second was caught in a crevice between two rocks, alive in the technical sense that the word required, a pulse she could find and a breath she could hear, and nothing more. She got the rope around him and pulled, which required more leverage than she expected from a man who looked unremarkable, and she understood from the density of his muscles that he had spent years doing the kind of work that built them. She got him up. She got him to the base of the path. She got him up the path by stages, resting where she needed to because there was no one to help her and no way to make the cliff less vertical, and he could do nothing except be dragged. She put him on the cot in the main room. She built the fire. She assessed the damage. Head wound, seawater in the lungs, cold deep in the tissues, and she addressed each in sequence with the materials she had, which were adequate because she had learned long ago that adequate was the only category available at the edge of the frontier, and had stocked accordingly. He was unconscious for 3 days. She worked around him. She kept the light. She ate, slept in the mechanism room as usual, wrote in the record book, checked the weather. The sea settled after the first day and turned a dark, satisfied gray, the way it did after expending itself. She went back to the wreck site and recovered what she could and buried the other man in the earth above the cliff on the south side where the wind was less, with a stone from the site and the ship's name written on it with tar because she had no other paint. She wrote the Ardent Cross into the record book on the third morning with the smallest handwriting she had ever used. She wrote both names. The second name she wrote without a ship beside it, without weather conditions, without bearing. Just the name. She did not know yet whether the absence of those details would need to be filled in later, or whether they would remain absent. She closed the book. That afternoon he opened his eyes. She was at the table. She did not look up immediately, which was not callousness, but the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned not to react to things before they finished happening. She heard the change in his breathing, the quality shift from unconscious to aware, and she let it settle before she set down her pen. He was looking at the ceiling. The light from the window was the flat afternoon white of an overcast sky, and the ceiling was stone, and he was clearly conducting a rapid and systematic inventory of where he was and what condition he was in. She said, "You are in a lighthouse, the north cliff above the settlement harbor. The storm was 3 days ago. You have a head wound that is healing cleanly, and you took considerable water into your lungs, which are less clean than the wound, but improving." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The ship." "Gone," she said. "I'm sorry." Another silence. "The others?" "I found 2. One didn't survive the night." She paused. "I don't know how many more there were." He closed his eyes. She went back to her writing and gave him the space that was the most useful thing she could offer. Later, she brought him water, and he drank it without assistance, which was a good sign, and she noted this in her margin notes and said nothing about it. She kept a second set of notes during those 3 days. Not in the record book, which was for ships, but in the maintenance log, which was the closest she had to a document about the lighthouse itself rather than what the lighthouse served. She wrote what she had done for him, and when, and what she observed, and what she expected. She wrote it in the same terms she would have used for a mechanism that had suffered damage in a storm and was being assessed for operability. She was not without feeling about the situation. She simply found that the clinical language was the most reliable way to think clearly about something that had the potential to become imprecise. On the second morning, she went back down to the wreck site and found 3 more bodies in the water. She pulled them above the tide line and came back up and noted the recovery in the log and went back down the following morning to bury them beside the first. The ground above the cliff was rocky but workable, and she had tools, and she was not in a hurry about anything except the light, which she tended through all of it on its regular schedule. She wrote each of their names on the record of the wreck. The manifest she recovered from the wreck site listed 19 crew. She had found 5. The sea had taken the others, or the rocks, and there was nothing she could do about that, and she had known it from the moment she saw the ardent cross come apart on the outer edge. It was not the first ship she had lost. It was never a thing she became indifferent to. He recovered in the way of people who were fundamentally healthy and had been trained by years of physical work into a body that did not give up quickly. By the end of the first week, he could sit upright. By the second, he was standing at the window, looking at the water with the expression of a man reading something he had spent his career learning to read. She watched him do this from the mechanism room and said nothing. When he was fit to walk, she said, "There is a path down the south face. It takes most of a day to reach the harbor on a good leg." He said, "I can see it from here. The supply boat comes in 4 weeks. There will be passage to the mainland." He turned from the window. He had dark eyes that moved the way navigators' eyes moved, taking in the room with the same comprehensive sweep he had been giving the water. "What do you need from me between now and then?" She had not expected this. She said, "Nothing. Rest." "I've been resting for 2 weeks." "Then continue." "I'd rather be useful." She considered this. "There's a housing joint on the northeast face that I've been meaning to reseal. It requires 2 people." "Show me what to use," he said. She showed him. He applied it with the careful precision of someone who had learned to do delicate work in rough conditions and did not need to be told twice. She watched his hands and understood from the way he held the tool that he had worked on ship housing before and had simply transferred the method. That evening, she said, "Leave before morning." He said, "All right." He asked about the mechanism in his first week of being mobile, not intrusively, but with the particular directness of someone who was accustomed to understanding how systems worked before he relied on them. She showed him the gear train, the lamp assembly, the lens, and its maintenance requirements. He listened and watched and asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which were the questions she would have asked in his place. He said, "How long to replace the primary gear if it fails?" She said, "If I have the spare, 2 hours. If I need to send for one, 6 days at minimum." He said, "What holds during those 6 days?" She showed him the manual override. He looked at it for a while. Then he said, "Show me how to run it." She showed him. He practiced until he could do it correctly. She did not explain why this was a sensible thing to know, and he did not ask. The northeast housing joint took them most of an afternoon. He worked with the same careful economy she brought to the mechanism. Not fast, not showy, simply correct. She noticed that he asked before he touched anything he was uncertain about, which was the right instinct for someone working on equipment that was not theirs in a context they did not yet fully understand. It was also the right instinct for someone working alongside a person who preferred to maintain control of their own domain. She noted both things without commenting on either. When she came down at first light, the cot was empty and the blanket was folded at the foot with the kind of precision that did not happen by accident. The day passed. She maintained the light, made her entries, watched the weather build and subside. She did not think about whether he would come back, which was a choice that required maintaining. At the hour before she needed to tend the light, he knocked. She had not locked the door. She noticed this as she went to open it. He came in without ceremony. He was carrying a small cloth bag, something from the harbor, she learned later. Dried fish, a good quality she did not have. He put it on the table and sat down in the chair that was not hers and did not require explanation. She fed them both. Later, the fire burning low in the way that meant the evening was finishing, she said, "Leave before morning." He said, "Yes." In the morning, he was gone again. This became the shape of the days. What she had not predicted was what he brought to the evenings besides his presence. He did not fill the lighthouse's particular quality of silence with noise. He inhabited it differently, shifted it slightly in the way that a second stone dropped in water changed the ripple pattern without canceling the first. He sat at the table with whatever he had been doing, charting by memory what he had known of the coastline, reading from the small shelf of books she kept, watching the fire with the focused patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting for conditions to change. He asked questions when they were worth asking. He did not ask them when they were not. She found this calibration unusual enough to notice and not unusual enough to comment on. She had not expected to find a vocabulary she shared with anyone this far out on the coast. The people in the settlement below were fishermen, practical and good-natured, and she had a functional relationship with them based on the light and the supply runs and the occasional storm warnings she sent down before the weather came. They valued her. She valued their presence in the harbor. They were not people who spoke her particular language, which was the language of reading complex systems from a distance and understanding what they meant. Kai spoke it. He spoke it in slightly different terms because his system was ships and hers was weather, but the underlying method was identical. The patience, the attention to small indicators, the refusal to describe something until you were certain of what you were seeing. She had noticed this in the first conversation they had after he could form complete sentences, and she had filed it as significant information without knowing what category to file it under. She understood the category better now. He had a quality of presence that was not demanding and not absent. He existed in the lighthouse's spaces without filling them incorrectly. He picked up after himself with a thoroughness that she recognized as the habit of a man who had spent years sharing confined spaces with other people and had learned that the alternative was intolerable. He took the chair that was not hers and sat in it with the ease of a man who had decided he was welcome, which he had not asked to be told and which she had not contradicted. She thought on one of the evenings in the 4th week when she was making the entry and the fire was going and he was at the table with the charts, "This is the specific shape of a thing I have not had." She made the entry. She closed the book. In the 3rd week, he found the record book. She had left it on the table while she went up to check the mechanism, which was developing a faint catch in the secondary gear that she wanted to examine before it became something larger. When she came down, he was seated where she had left him, but he was not looking at what he had been looking at before. He was looking at the record book. He had not touched it. It lay open to the page she had been reviewing, the entries from the previous autumn, but he was reading it where it sat. She sat down across from him. He said, "The Ardent Cross." She said, "Yes." He said, "I was on the Peregrine, her sister ship, 3 years ago when the Ardent first went down off the Keln coast." He paused. "I tracked the bearing afterward. I always wondered if the lighthouse keeper there knew what she'd done." Lyra looked at the record book. "I knew." He said, "What did you see from up here?" She told him. She told him what the light showed her and what the water showed her and what she wrote in the entry for that night and why she had written each thing. He listened the way navigators listened to weather reports, with the specific attentiveness of someone building a picture from multiple data points simultaneously. Then he told her what the peregrine had seen from the water. The bearing, the rocks, the moment the light caught, and the moment the ship's crew understood what it meant and what it did not mean for the ship that was already too far into the rocks. Two sides of the same event, neither of them complete alone. They talked for 2 hours. The fire burned down and neither of them noticed until the chill reached them and she added wood without thinking about it, which was something she did alone, which she was no longer doing. When he left, she sat for a while at the table, the record book open between her hands. She picked up the pen and wrote in the margin beside his name a single notation. Then she closed the book and set it on the shelf. In the 4th week, she began leaving a cup for him in the evenings. Hot when he arrived, covered with a small plate to hold the warmth if he was later than usual. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. He drank it every evening. The particular quality of the lighthouse in those weeks was something she would have found difficult to describe if asked, which she was not. The evenings had a texture they had not had before. Not the silence of one person in a stone room above the sea, but the silence of two people who had independently discovered that silence was not absence, but a form of attention, and who could be silent in the same room without the silence being a gap between them. She knew the lighthouse's sounds the way she knew her own breathing, the specific creak of the mechanism at quarter turn, the sound the door made in wet weather versus dry, the way the wind through the housing changed pitch with the direction. She knew these things without thinking about them, the way the body knew its own position without looking. She had begun to know his sounds in the same way. The weight of his step on the path before he reached the door, heavier on the left from the wreck injury that had healed imperfectly and which he would carry forward. The way he moved through the kitchen in the mornings when he was up before her. The specific quality of his silence when he was reading something carefully versus the different quality when he was simply present. She noted this without deciding what to do with it. She kept noting it. One evening she was making the light adjustments for a fog bank coming in from the north, a change in the lamp angle, a shift in intensity, and she called down the correction to him because he was closer to the secondary adjustment lever and it was faster to ask than to go herself, and he made the adjustment with the precision she had come to rely on and called back the confirmation. She realized afterward that she had called down to him without deciding to call down to him. She had simply known he was there and available and precise, and she had used him, which was the word she would have used for a tool, and which was not quite right in this context, and which she was going to need better language for eventually. She finished the fog adjustment. She came down from the housing. He was back in his chair with the charts. She sat down. She picked up her cup. There was an evening when she was at the upper platform checking the housing seals, and he came up behind her with the lantern at the angle she needed without being asked, and she understood from the position of the light that he had watched her work before and remembered what she required. She did not say anything. Neither did he. She worked. He held the lantern. There was an evening when the fishing boat from the settlement below got into trouble in a rising wind. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of situation where the light's positioning mattered, and Lyra went up to the housing to make a specific adjustment, and Kai came up behind her without being summoned and held the housing steady while she worked. He had understood without explanation that the wind was making the adjustment difficult and that a second pair of hands at the housing point was the relevant help. She made the adjustment. She did not say thank you, and he did not require it. Afterward, they stood on the upper platform and watched the fishing boat make the harbor entrance. The wind was coming in off the water with the cold that belonged to the turning of the season, and they were standing close because the platform was not large and because the light needed to be clear of both of them. She could feel the warmth of him a few inches from her arm. She turned back to the door. He followed. Inside, she made tea, and they sat on opposite sides of the table, and she looked at his hands, which she had been looking at without appearing to look at since the first evening. They were a navigator's hands, in the specific way of someone who had spent years doing the physical work of the profession, as well as its intellectual demands. The knuckles scarred from ropes, the fingers precise and quick. She had hands that looked like his in some ways and not in others, the similarities being the kind that accumulated from years of skilled work regardless of the skill. She thought, "We have both spent our careers learning to read the same thing from different angles." She did not say this. She drank her tea. There was an evening when the weather was coming in from the east. She could feel it in the way the air moved, hear it in the pitch of the water, and she said something about the swell pattern she had been watching all day without naming, and he said the word for it before she did. A nautical term she knew but had not expected him to apply to what she was observing. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon. She understood that they were reading the same water from different vocabularies and arriving at the same translation. They stood at the window for 2 hours that night, watching the storm assemble itself offshore. When she said leave before morning, he went without ceremony, the way he always did, and the storm arrived at midnight. She was alone in it. She was always alone in storms. The night felt no different and slightly different, and she did not examine this distinction at any length. There was an evening when she fell asleep in the chair. She had been up for most of the previous night, adjusting the mechanism through a difficult wind shift, and the warmth and the hour simply took her without asking permission. She woke when the light changed and found the fire banked carefully and the lamp turned low, and him gone. He had done these things, which required moving through the room close to where she slept, which she registered as a fact and filed without examining. In the 5th week, there was a night when neither of them talked much, but both of them stayed later than the evening usually ran, the fire still going and both of them at the table, her with the maintenance records and him with the coastline charts he was making. She looked up at some point and found him looking at her, not quickly, not guiltily, with the same direct readiness he brought to everything he looked at. She met it. Neither of them adjusted their expression. She looked back at the maintenance records. After a while, he said, "The secondary swell pattern south of the outer marker. It changes in November." She said, "Yes. The subsurface shelf redirects the current as the water temperature drops." He said, "I noticed it in the charts from the 3rd week. I've been tracking it." She said, "What are your findings?" He described them. She confirmed where his observations matched hers and corrected one small error in his notation, explaining what he had misread in the water's behavior. He took the correction the way a good navigator took a correction, immediately, precisely, without ego about the point being corrected. She said, "Your track record on the secondary swell is better than your notation suggested." He said, "I had the data right. I described it wrong." She said, "That's a different kind of error." He said, "Yes." She went back to her records. He went back to his charts. The fire burned. The mechanism turned. Outside, the sea moved through its November preparations in the dark below, doing what it always did, indifferent to the stone room above it and the 2 people in it, and the particular silence between them that had become its own kind of fluency. In the 6th week, he brought oil for the mechanism housing from the settlement, the specific grade she needed that did not come on the standard supply order. He had heard her mention it. He had not made anything of the bringing. He simply put it on the supply shelf with the other materials and went to his chair. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelf for a moment. She did not leave his cup that night, which she could not have explained precisely. The next evening she left it and said nothing, and he said nothing, and this was also a form of the conversation they had been having for 6 weeks without using any of its actual words. The 4 weeks after the supply boat left had a quality she recognized from other periods of her life when something she had not known she was accustomed to became suddenly absent. She had moved to the lighthouse after 7 years in the inland settlement, and in the first weeks she had felt the absence of other people's noise not as relief but as a strange hollowness, the way a tooth socket feels in the days after an extraction, the presence of absence being somehow louder than either the original thing or the simple emptiness. This was similar but not the same. She was not suffering from his departure. She functioned correctly. She tended the light and made her entries and read her books and ate at the usual hour and slept on the cot in the mechanism room where she could hear the gear. She was adequate. She had been adequate for 6 years, and the return to adequacy was not difficult. What was different was the table. She had always sat on one side of it. This was simply true. But the fact that there was another side, and that the other side now had a quality of vacancy it had not previously had, was a thing she noticed the way she noticed the secondary swell pattern, not as something that could be changed, only as something that was there and had its own implications. She made 1 cup in the mornings. On the 9th day without him, she went through his side of the room, the area he had occupied, which was modest, and found nothing he had left behind except the specific quality of having been there, which was not a physical thing and which she could not do anything about. She did not try. The fisherman brought the company's message on the 14th day. She read it and understood that he had received something similar and that he had choices she was not party to. She wrote nothing in reply and told the fisherman there was no message for the mainland, which was true. She checked the northeast housing joint that he had told her to check. He was right about the sealant. She noted the repair in the maintenance log and wrote his name in the notation column where she recorded who had identified the issue. And then she looked at his name there for a moment and went to make her evening entry. The supply boat came on a Tuesday. Captain Dren had been making this run for 6 years, and he had a particular way of conducting his business with her that involved efficiency and a complete absence of unnecessary conversation, which she had always appreciated. He came up the path himself with the supply manifest, and they went through it in the usual way, and she signed where she needed to sign. He saw Kai when they went inside to check the interior supplies. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Navigator off the Ardent Cross." She said, "Yes." Dren looked at Kai. He said, "The company's been asking. They have a berth open on the Solander, eastern route." Kai was quiet for a moment. He said, "Thank you for the information. I can take you back with the boat today if you want." Another pause, shorter than it looked. "Yes," Kai said. "All right." She went out to help with the cargo transfers. She counted crates. She checked her order against the manifest. She noted a discrepancy in the salt allotment and had it corrected. She was thorough. She did this thoroughly. When she came back inside, he had his chart case and his coat and the bag he had arrived with, which held very little because very little had survived the wreck. He said, "The northeast housing joint. Check it after the next hard rain. I think the sealant moved during last week's storm." She said, "I will." He said, "The record book." He looked at it on the shelf. "I'd like to read the rest of it sometime." She said, "It will still be here." He nodded once. He went down the path. She watched from the upper platform, not because she had decided to, but because the platform was where she was when she needed to see the distance. The boat left on the afternoon tide. She watched it go until it was past the outer marker, and then she went inside and tended the light. She made 1 cup in the mornings. She checked the northeast joint as instructed and found that he was right about the sealant. She reapplied it on a clear afternoon and wrote the date and the repair in the maintenance log with the notation that the original assessment had been made by the previous occupant. Then she looked at what she had written and crossed out previous occupant and wrote K. Nast, which was his full name, which she had learned from the ship's manifest she had kept from the night of the wreck. The fisherman came up the path in the 3rd week with a folded message from the mainland company. She read it, noted that the Solander posting had been filled but that there was a position on a different vessel, better paying, a western route. She did not know if he would receive the same message through other channels. She did not send a reply. She put the message in the record book between 2 pages to keep it flat, which was also a choice. 4 weeks without the cup on the other side of the table. 4 weeks of the chair that was not hers standing in its usual position without being occupied. She worked. She maintained the light. She read every evening and made her entries and watched the weather patterns build and dissolve across the water, which was absorbing and sufficient, and which was also not the same as it had been before October. She did not think about this at length. She tended the light. On the next supply run, Captain Dren's boat appeared on the horizon at the usual hour, and she watched it come in from the platform, and she went down to meet it. The return journey up the cliff path was something she would not have watched if she had decided in advance whether to watch it. She found herself on the upper platform because she had been checking the housing seals, and the platform was where the housing seals were, and from the platform she could see the path. He climbed the way he had always climbed it, not in a hurry, measuring the footing. The chart case was over his shoulder. He was looking at the lighthouse above him and not at the path beneath his feet, which was the walk of someone who was going somewhere specific and had already checked the route. She finished the housing check. She went inside. She sat at the table. She put her hands on the record book because her hands needed to be on something, and the record book was there. The door opened. He came in and set the chart case against the wall in the place it had always stood. Not a considered choice, she thought, simply the place where it went. And he looked at the room with the particular quality of someone looking at something familiar after an interval. He looked at the table. He looked at the mechanism room door and the shelf of supply materials. He looked at her. She said, "Sit down." He sat down. She got up and made coffee and put his cup on the table in front of him and sat back down with hers, and they were in the same positions they had been in for 6 weeks of evenings, which was either remarkable or not remarkable, depending on how you held it. He said, "The housing on the south face." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I noticed from the path. The flashing has lifted on the east corner." She had not checked the south face that morning. She said, "I'll look at it this afternoon." He said, "It's a 2-person job." She said, "Yes." He picked up his cup. Kai climbed the path last. He had a canvas chart case over one shoulder, and he was moving at the pace of a man who was not in a hurry because he had decided where he was going. She was at the top with the supply manifest. She did not go to the edge to meet him. She waited where she was. He reached the top. He set the chart case down on the stone and looked at the housing on the northeast face, and then at the horizon. He said, "The company offered a new route." She said, "The fisherman brought the message." He said, "I turned it down." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lighthouse, the water, the specific angle of light on the outer rocks that changed with the season. He said, "The navigation here is more interesting." She knew what he meant, and it was not about the rocks. She said, "The housing will need checking before the November storms." He said, "I can see where." She said, "It is not a 1-person job." He picked up the chart case and went inside. She finished the supply check with Dren, who said nothing particular and whose not saying anything particular was itself a comment. She signed the manifest and walked him back down the first section of path and came back up. When she came inside, there was a cup on the table, hot, covered with the small plate she used for the purpose. He had found it in the cabinet where she kept it. He was in his chair with the chart case open, spreading the pages she had not seen before, his working charts, the ones he had salvaged from the wreck site on his first days in the settlement. She sat down. She picked up her cup. She said, "You recovered the charts?" He said, "The case washed up intact. I found it the second day." She looked at the charts. He had the coastline she could see from the upper platform drawn in precise detail, the outer rocks, the shelf depth, the currents she knew by name and by season. There were notations she recognized as weather pattern markings, and some she did not. She said, "What is that notation?" He explained. She explained the equivalent in her own system. They matched the two vocabularies across the page for an hour, comparing what he had charted against what she had recorded, and the picture that emerged was more complete than either version alone. She had a habit of standing at the upper platform before the evening tending, looking at the water. She had done this since her first week at the lighthouse. It was part of her preparation, a way of reading the sea before she committed to the light's specific bearing for the night. The sea told her things that the instruments confirmed later, and she trusted the combination. In the weeks he had been there, he came up to the platform sometimes when she was doing this. Not always. He read her body language well enough to know when she wanted the observation to be private and when the presence of another reading was welcome. When he came up, he stood beside her, and they looked at the same water and said things and didn't say things in roughly equal measure, and the combined silence and observation produced something that felt like the conversations she had been having with the sea alone for 6 years, but with a second interlocutor, which changed the nature of the exchange in ways she had not predicted. She had stood there alone for 4 weeks after the boat took him. The sea was the same sea. It told her the same things. She made the same entries. She was simply doing it without anyone to confirm or contest the reading, which was how she had done it for 6 years before October, and which was, therefore, normal. She stood there on his first evening back and said nothing, because the platform was not for conversation, and he came up behind her and said nothing, and they looked at the water together. After a while he said, "The current has shifted since September." She said, "Yes." "It shifts fully by the first week of November." He said, "I have it in the charts." She said, "I have it in the records." He said, "We should compare them." She said, "Yes." They went inside. On one of his early evenings back, she asked about the charts, specifically the section he had spent 3 consecutive evenings working on, a portion of coastline she recognized as roughly 30 miles south, which she had never charted herself because it was outside the lighthouse's operational range. He spread the section across the table and explained what he was reconstructing from memory. His ship had run that coast 40 times, and he carried the detail in his mind the way she carried her weather patterns. Not rote memorization, but actual knowledge, the kind that lives in the body and can be called on without conscious effort. She asked questions. He answered. She added 2 pieces of information from her own storm pattern records that applied to that section of water, and he marked them in his notation and said, "I've been working on this from the ship's side. You're giving me the sky." She said, "And you're giving me what the water looks like when the sky is wrong." He said, "Yes." She looked at the chart for a moment. "This section, the tidal shelf here." She put her finger above the paper, not touching it. "In November, the shelf drains differently than your notation indicates. The current pulls east instead of running parallel." He looked where she indicated. He said, "Is that in your records?" She said, 4 years of November observations." He said, "I'd like to see them." She brought out the record book. They spent 2 hours cross-referencing her weather records against his navigational charts, and what emerged was a picture of that stretch of coast more complete than either had seen before, because neither had had access to the other's angle. She thought, this is what 2 different kinds of expertise look like when they share a table. She thought, I have not had this before. She said nothing about either thought. She went back to the records. Later, she opened the record book to the last entry, his name, the date, the blank spaces beside it. She picked up the pen. He said, "What are you writing?" She said, "The weather conditions." He said, "What were the weather conditions when I arrived?" She said, "Storm." A pause. "And also what came after?" He was quiet. She finished the notation and closed the book. She set the pen down. Outside, the autumn sea moved in its darkening way, the light above them cycling through its circuit, sweeping the water below with the slow, metronomic certainty of something that had been doing this for a very long time. She said, "The record book, the first night you looked at it." He said, "Yes." She said, "The entry you were reading. What did you notice?" He said, "That you wrote the names of the survivors in a different hand than the ship entry." She said nothing. He said, "Smaller, like you were trying to make it fit somewhere you weren't sure it belonged." The fire shifted, the light turned. Through the stone walls she could hear the water 300 feet below, the consistent voice of something that did not need quiet to be heard. She said, "And tonight? What will you notice?" He looked at the record book on the table between them, at the notation she had made, which he had not read and which she had not shown him. He said, "That you wrote it in the same size as everything else." She met his eyes. In 6 years, she had learned most of what the sea could show her. She had not expected to find the same quality of reading in a person, that specific attentiveness, the patience that was not stillness but was something more like readiness. She said, "Leave before morning." He said, "Yes." The quality of the yes was not the same as the first yes, or the second, or any of the yeses that had accumulated in the weeks between. They both knew this, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things were more precisely expressed through the pattern itself than through the words one might use to describe the pattern. He went at the usual hour. She banked the fire. She climbed to the mechanism room and checked the gear and found it running cleanly, the faint catch she had been monitoring having resolved itself. She lay on the narrow cot and listened to the turning. In the morning, the lighthouse was hers in the specific and particular way it had always been hers. The stone walls, the record books, the mechanism above, the sea below. She made coffee. She moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of 6 years of the same routine, the same sequence, the same certainty about where everything was. She put 2 cups on the table. She stood and looked at the 2 cups for a moment. One of them was hers. The other one was not hers, and was not his exactly because he was not here, and yet she had filled it without deciding to fill it, which told her something she had already known but had not yet put into the record. She sat in her chair. The other chair was where it always was. The record book was on the shelf where she had put it. The chart case was on the floor beside the other chair, which was where he had left it, which was different from his leaving it somewhere else and which she had noticed and not mentioned. She thought about what he had said, that the navigation was more interesting here. She sat with it the way she sat with weather observations that required confirmation before she entered them into the record, as data that she did not know yet what to do with, but which was clearly significant. He had come back. He had had choices: the company, the other vessel, the route that paid more than this coast offered. And he had come back to a lighthouse keeper's work on a cliff above the water, with no ship beneath him and no career trajectory that led anywhere except here. She did not know how to categorize this. She understood clearly what it meant, which was not the same as knowing what to do with the understanding. She understood that she had made 2 cups this morning. She understood that she had not been surprised that she made them. She understood that the surprise she would have expected 6 weeks ago, the surprise of finding herself setting out a cup for someone who was not there, had not arrived, which meant something had shifted between October and now that she had not tracked as precisely as she tracked the weather. The mechanism turned. The light swept its arc. Below, the sea was doing what the sea did, which was all of everything at once, which she had found sufficient for 6 years and which she was finding was also a context in which other things could be sufficient alongside it. She was going to have to write an entry. She had been writing entries for 6 years. She opened the record book. She thought about the entry she had made beside his name, the words she had added which described what had followed the storm. She had written it in the same hand as everything else, which was a fact that turned out to mean something. She had not known it would mean something when she wrote it. She had simply reached the point where the smaller handwriting was no longer honest. There was something about honesty in records that she had always found non-negotiable. The record was only useful if it was accurate. An entry that minimized or avoided was worse than no entry. This had always been her practice. She had applied it to the entry for his name the way she applied it to everything else, and the result was what it was. She was going to have to apply it again in the morning entry. She knew what the morning entry should say. She knew what the 2 cups on the table meant, and what the chart case against the wall meant, and what the quality of his yes had meant last night when she said, "Leave before morning," and he said yes, and both of them knew the distance between that yes and the first one. She was a person who wrote things down. She had been doing it for 6 years, and before that, and before that. The record was the record. She picked up the pen. She opened the record book to the morning entry page. She dated it. She noted the weather, the wind from the northwest, the swell pattern, the cloud cover giving way to the particular blue that came after a clear night. She wrote the visibility in the standard notation. She looked at the entry for his arrival, the full notation now, his name and the date and the storm and what had followed the storm, written in the same hand as everything else, fitting where it belonged. She wrote the morning's final line, "Light functioning, all vessels accounted for." Then she closed the book and sat with her coffee and the autumn light coming through the window at the angle it came at this hour on this coast, and the sea visible below doing what it did, which was all of everything at once, and the day between now and evening, which was a day like other days, and not like them at all. The record book had been accumulating for 6 years. She had filled 4 volumes and was partway through the 5th. The entries were consistent. Date, vessel name, weather conditions, bearing adjustment, if any, outcome, and they were also, in aggregate, a record of 6 years of work whose quality could be read in the absence of disasters. Every ship that came through and made the harbor entrance was an entry. Every ship that did not make it was a different kind of entry, and those were fewer than they would have been without the light, which was the whole point. She had shown him the earlier volumes in the 2nd week, not as a gesture, but because he had asked what was in them, and the answer was relevant to a conversation they were having about the outer rocks. He had read through several years of entries with the attentiveness he brought to navigation charts, which was the attentiveness of someone building a model of a system from available data. He said, "Your writing changes over the years." She said, "Does it?" He said, "In the 1st volume, it's precise but slightly formal. By the 4th, it's precise and completely comfortable." The way someone's handwriting changes when they've been doing something long enough to stop thinking about the form and start thinking only about the content. She looked at the volume in front of him. She had not noticed this. She said, "What does the current volume look like?" He turned to the most recent pages and looked at them for a moment. He said, "Like someone who has been doing this long enough to be very, very good at it. And who knows it." She took the volume back. She looked at the page. He was not wrong. She said, "And your charts?" He said, "Ask me in another 6 years." She set the volume back on the shelf. She picked up her coffee. The other cup steamed quietly on the other side of the table, waiting for an evening that was still several hours away, patient in the manner of things that had decided they belonged where they were.